right. So you are Eugene McCarraher, writer, critic, literary critic, historian, philosopher, if you wish, dissolute.
You'll like it.
Bit of a ragamuffin. Yeah, no, I mean, on the whole, though, you are Eugene McCarraher, and that name, of course, rings down the centuries already.
I thank you. You said as much in your marvelous review of my book.
That's right. Speaking of which, your most recent, although it's not, it's been out for a couple years now, but your most recent, and I suppose your largest and most ambitious work in print is, in fact, The Enchantments of Mammon, How Capitalism Became the Religion of Modernity. This book took some time to write, because I know that over the course of its composition, I published, 18 books or something. I remember thinking, every time we met, I asked you how the book was coming, and I was beginning to think that it was somewhat like my adolescent fascination with Barbara Eden. It was simply not destined to be reciprocated. But at last it appeared, and it is a great work. And I thought we might today talk about such things as enchantment and disenchantment and capitalism and modernity and the way of things. And then just move on to what other topics appeal to us. I think you mentioned universalism as well. That's always fun to talk about, because you can always go off into side paths of abusing Thomists and the like, and that's always fun. It's a healthy entertainment,
Well, I have to be careful about that, because I have a couple of Thomists in the humanities department.
Yeah, but I mean, when you say Thomist, let me ask you, before we get to your book, how do you use the word Thomist? Because, of course, I
hardly ever do.
Yeah, right. Well, I do when I'm, stub my toe or something. But for me, it's a word that doesn't have anything much to do with Thomas Aquinas, though he's there in the background. I use it principally to indicate the school of Thomism, which arose in the 16th century, came to what we thought was something of a grinding halt in the 20th, but in fact is now in revival, mostly because I think it's, though it's an anomalous form of Catholicism, though it's theologically outside the great tradition in many respects, it's hospitable to psychopathy. And so I think that if your religious inclinations are at the same time both Christian and psychopathic, that's a hard combination to pull off unless you have a system in place.
Let me first say that I don't think of my two colleagues here as psychopathic.
Right.
I want to say
but would you call them Thomists in that manualist, that very limited sense, or do you just mean that they're scholars of Thomas Aquinas?
Yeah, that's probably a better way to put it. They certainly are not in the manualist lineage at all. Well, in fact, actually, I should say that maybe one Thomist. One Thomist, Mary Hirschfeld, who has 2 PhDs, by the way, in economics and theology. She left Villanova just last year for Notre Dame. And Mary's book, Aquinas in the Market, is a very good book, I think.
Yeah.
But definitely not in the manualist tradition at all.
Well, you see, that's the thing, is now and this has been so, I think, since the 1950s, the word Thomist came to mean scholars of Thomas. And so quite often it takes in the very people who were the most devastating critics of the school. They called itself Thomism from the time of Bagnes up through Garrigou-Lagrange.
Thanks to thanks in part to you, and I think also partly in thanks to some of the things that John Milbank has written and said about a lot of these Thomists that both of you take a justified delight in bashing. I have read a little bit around us, especially in this that I can't remember the other guy's name, Finister volume.
Finister and Crayon.
I think that's right.
The book on integralism, yeah.
Just absolutely appalling.
Yeah.
I wonder what this has to do with Christianity.
Oh, absolutely nothing. If anything, Christianity is the great embarrassing secret that the integralists are trying to bury. This peculiar, somewhat antinomian figure from first century Judea is a real problem for them, because for them what God desires is hatred, intolerance, cruelty, violence, and despotism. I mean, that's how you know that someone is righteous, that is intolerant of weakness and spitefully cruel to those who disagree with him. I have no idea, honestly. I mean, the people, those who think, for instance, that my rhetoric is excessive when talking about this tradition, often, I think, are entirely ignorant of what this tradition is. They, for one thing, they do. It's my fault. When I use the word Thomism, in my mind, I'm thinking the Banyasians. Okay, I'm thinking specifically this strain of thought with its two-tier notion of supernature, nature, which was briefly a dominant force in Catholic thought, but then the whole of 20th century Catholic, the whole great revival of Catholic theology in the 20th century was in some sense simply the rejection of this system, and a return to the Church Fathers and into a completely different reading of Thomas, which began in part with figures like, Lonergan, and just saying, the Thomas of Thomism is a modern construct that no 13th century thinker could possibly have actually embodied. But that does bring us, strangely, curiously, to your book, because, of course, the problem with that kind of Thomism is precisely that it's indelibly marked by incipient modernity. Mm-hmm. It thinks of...
Enchantment is already waiting in the wings in a lot of this. I mean, when you completely separate nature and grace the way that they do, you're inexorable. You're going to end up with some sort of disenchanted, de-animated view of nature and the cosmos, and it's not going to be at all, to use a word that you've used quite often. It's not going to be theophanic anymore. It's just going to be dumb, inanimate stuff, which it never is, right? I mean, I think you and I would agree on that. But I mean, once you make this kind of rigid demarcation of nature and grace, then you're sort of off to the races as far as disenchantment, or spurious kind of disenchantment.
Right. Well, I mean, to me, we tend to think of the alienation of spirit from nature. Let's talk like German idealists, as more or less a post-Cartesian dualism. But
it goes farther back.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think that those 16th century systems, Catholic as much as Protestant, but both really, had actually laid the foundation for the mechanistic metaphysics of modernity and the separation between a soul in here looking out on an alien reality out there that's nothing but dead matter, arranged so cunningly that it at times even has the appearance of vitality to it, That's already the foundation for that way of thinking has already been laid by this, already by the strict partition erected between supernature and nature, between grace and nature. And you see already there also, it seems to me, the beginning of a picture of causality as not really the analogical difference between primary and secondary causality of the High Middle Ages and implicitly the whole classical tradition, but actually causality that is determination, so that even grace has to be understood, even permissive grace in the Thomistic system, as having an absolutely determining effect or predetermining effect on what follows from it, and the notion of a kind of open antecedent finality in spirit or nature has disappeared. I mean, the formal and final causality are already on the way to being misunderstood as defective theories about mechanical causality. I'm getting very recherché very quickly here. I actually wanted to talk about your book.
I guess part of what going on in the first or maybe the chapters of my book is to chronicle sort of a hinterland between these two positions, where you get this notion of in the High Middle Ages of this, enchanted universe, this sacramental universe, this euphanic depiction of the cosmos, and the subsequent, I would say, maybe 2-3 centuries, you're getting the disintegration of this. But that's what's interesting to me about a lot of what goes on with the mechanical philosophy at this time, is that you will get people like the Puritans, who are often taken to be the vanguard, enchantment. But they still, in many ways, believe in some kind of an enchanted cosmos. They still believe in demons and thinking of the universe as what one Thomas Beard, I think his name was, calls the theater of God's judgments. They could see punishments in storms. They could see moral lessons in the skies, and so it's a slow process. By which the mechanical philosophy becomes completely, utterly secular and disenchanted. But it's a process, and it's. You'll get people like Thomas Hobbes, who are pretty, paid up secularists, I think. But you'll even get people like Isaac Newton as late as the 17th century, who still, has interest in Rosicrucianism and all of this. So it's a jumble, I think, in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think nothing was predestined. I mean, I think that the migration of the mechanical picture from what was originally just an attempt to create an inductive method into a tacit cultural metaphysics is not a predestined thing. It was perhaps an almost irresistible momentum in history, but again, for somewhat contingent reasons, I think, and some of those reasons had to do with the rise of early capitalism, or the transition from mercantilism to capitalism.
Yeah, I was just about to say that I think capitalism is a key moment in this process, because capitalism is ultimately about the abstraction of money. It's about, and money is, numbers, it's data. And so once you start thinking about ordinary life increasingly in terms of abstraction, which is ultimately what money is, it's inevitable that you're going to begin to see the universe as itself just a compilation of data and mechanical forces. So that's one of the reasons I think capitalism is obviously a key. It's the political economy of secularism in a way, in an odd way. Even though, maybe I'm getting ahead of the discussion here, I think there's
no ahead or behind these discussions. are
So,
nothing. Yeah, they're nothing but branchings, trying to find their way back to the original stream bed.
so once money, basically becomes the metaphysical arbiter of what's real in this civilization, then, in a sense, you are secular. But at the same time, it seems to me that money has in fact displaced God as this moral and metaphysical arbiter. I mean, one way I like to illustrate that, both in the book and in courses that I teach, is to talk about this economic concept of effective demand. So if you're thirsty, but you have no money to pay for water, your thirst does not exist as a matter of the marketplace. It literally does not exist. Once, however, you have the money to buy a bottle of water or whatever, then all of a sudden your demand is effective, which means it exists, which means what has brought this thirst into existence? Money. Hence, money is the great enchanter. In other words, it's not just a moral arbiter. It determines in the marketplace what exists.
Right. It becomes an ontology ultimately. The real is, well, I mean, that's also the project of modernity. Of course, if we're going to reduce it to the rise of mechanism as a metaphysics, if we're going to see that as the modernity that won out, not the necessary modernity, not the modernity that might have been, that might have, say, gone in a different direction with more of a Renaissance impulse in it. Let's put it that way, in a vague way.
Well, I think in a way, and my own book, I think what I'm talking about is this alternative modernity, is what I'm calling Romanticism.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. It's that this was not a destined thing. Nonetheless, the modernity that won out is the one that tells us that that knowledge is power, and that the project of gaining knowledge is the project of achieving a power over nature that allows one to not only rack it for its secrets, but to subordinate it to the projects of human will, right? And you have to think that this is this sort of Promethean, exuberant understanding of knowledge that you find expressed in different ways, even by Leibniz, pious man that he was, but by Bacon and others. Already is tacitly allied. Not consciously, but tacitly allied to the rising market economy, in the sense of the new possibilities opening up in terms of the acquisition of wealth and the plundering of resources from around the world. There is I'm not one of those. I'm not a Marxist, so I don't believe that material conditions are quite as supreme over ideology as if I were a classical Marxist. But it is obvious to me that you can't separate the two. You can't say simply that mechanism, which started as this sort of humble notion of a new organon for the sciences working itself out in the laboratory, or the early form of the laboratory, which was not unlike a magician's workshop as well, but or an alchemist's workshop, precipitated the entire catastrophic reality of a mechanistic metaphysics that's given us the sort of age of the machine in which we live. But neither can you say that those ideas didn't profoundly influenced the way we see reality, and that they gained dominance precisely because they were in keeping with an emerging material economy.
Yeah, I'm thinking here of three individuals: John Calvin, Francis Bacon, and John Locke. John Calvin is, I know, a bit more that we share.
Hey, he wrote beautiful Latin and beautiful French.
Yes, but such horrid ideas expressed therein.
I know, but I mean, you have to give credit where credit is due.
I mean, in John Calvin, right? It's and I know, I mean, I know there's a long theological history to this, stemming from the late Augustine and so on, involving destination and. But basically, what you're seeing in Calvin, I think, which comports well with this emerging mechanical philosophy, is this conception of God as like pure volition, right? I mean, as pure will and agency. And God in Calvin, it seems to me, God goes from being, this God of love and mercy to being this kind of almighty cosmic badass. Who just does things because he can.
Well, that is the doctrine of absolute sovereignty, which, curiously enough, in another way, ideologically, of course, is complicit also, or in keeping with the rise of absolute sovereignty in the early modern age, and the absolute sovereignty of the state and of the monarch, or ultimately of what would replace the monarch. I will point out, though, that in a sense, the same thing is happening in the Catholic world. That's why, I mean, again, the two-tier Thomism I was complaining about has much the same view of God. It's simply concealed better behind scholastic terminology that seems intellectualist. That that God isn't just an abyss of pure predestining will acting out of sovereignty for the sake of sovereignty. But it ultimately boils down to that anyway, when you see the assertions actually being made. So it's very much of the time, right? I mean, it's not simply Calvin. It's the whole Western Christian world, the whole Western European world.
Right. And the second fellow I mentioned there, Francis Bacon, is sort of the next stop on the train, so to speak. You get somebody like Bacon writing the New Atlantis, and at the same time this Novum Organum, which articulates this conception of science and of knowledge itself as, you said, as just the acquisition of power. And in the New Atlantis, there's that renowned and rather harrowing declaration that the purpose of everything that goes on at this basically prototype for modern scientific enterprise is, in Bacon's words, to extend the bounds of human empire to the effecting of all things possible. There's your Calvinist God right there, come down to earth. And by the time you get to John Locke in the second treatise, Locke is basically telling his readers, the reason why God created this beautiful planet of ours is for you to exploit it.
Yep.
So go to it. Be about his business, as Locke put it, and they do mean business.
Oh yeah. They mean business. It's I think the real force of your book, and other than that, the sheer preponderance of the thing. I mean, you can kill a moose with this thing if you.
Well, you could do bicep curls with it as well, I guess. But.
Yeah. Well, actually that works. Is the recognition, though, that what we tend to call disenchantment, what's become the standard phrase for understanding of our relationship with nature, was not the disenchantment of a dawning age of realism. It's not because of course the really perfidious claim of what Mark Fisher calls capitalist realism is that this view of things is simply in keeping with the fashion of the world. That this is the nature of things. That life at basis is at power, seeking not only its own preservation but its expansion. This, of course, gets taken up into sort of popularized Darwinism in the 19th century, which then reverts into economics and social theory again. But the claim that this is what nature truly dictates, that nature, red in tooth and claw, is the entire story of life and is the mechanism by which the universe operates, is the great ideological triumph of the modern period. It's amazing, to be honest, how unquestioned that idea is, and how fiercely people will fight for it, even those you would think who would be disposed to reject that picture of reality. The great defenders today, for instance, of a kind of gradualist neo-Darwinism, for instance, even though that scientifically for 75 years or more, we've known that this is a wildly inaccurate picture of evolutionary history. Since the time of Barbara McClintock onward, we've been discovering again and again and again that life actually has all sorts of. The story of evolution is full of stories of cooperation, of not of selfish genes, certainly, because genes are in fact, whatever genes are, they're an incredibly inert molecule. We know that the work of evolution goes on in a systems level, and so it's everything from the cellular to the social is more consequential for actual macroevolution than anything like chance mutation at the level of the genome and all that.
You could say that Peter Kropotkin got it right.
Kropotkin. That's the funny thing it's those who were a bit Lamarckian and in the case of Kropotkin, who talked about cooperation as the ground of evolution, are much closer to what the scientific evidence today preponderantly, in fact, almost overwhelmingly, tells us. But
yet another reason to prefer the anarchists to the Marxists.
That too, that's true. I have always had more of a leaning towards the Kropotkins than towards the Marxists. I know a lot of very charming Marxists, don't get me wrong, but they're all, the good ones are all heretics already. They've already broken with the orthodox system. So
the thing about Marxism, to jump onto something that you said earlier about how even people who should be disposed to oppose this kind of a worldview of unrelenting struggle and all that. This is I think one of the things that finally convinced me that I couldn't be a Marxist in the end, which is that if you're a serious Marxist, it seems to me, you have to see capitalism as a good thing.
Yeah. That's been my problem with the tradition is that it actually, in a sense, proposes the necessity of capitalism as people will cite Marx at times. Everything solid melts in the air, as if this is a lament.
Right.
But it's not. It's a very ambiguous proclamation that he admires the power of capitalism to break down these traditional associations that he sees as rooted in feudalism and so on and so forth.
This is one of the problems I've always had with the Marxist, account of something like mechanization or what we would call automation today. I really don't see any difference except in nomenclature. You have to see mechanization. You have to see the destruction of artisanal skills as progressive. You have to have a positive thing. And there shouldn't be any warrant in Marxism for opposing the replacement of human beings by algorithms or any kind of AI. Yeah, I got interested in this question about a decade or so ago when I started noticing that there were all of these left-wing celebrants of automation, and I thought, what are you doing? These things are going to either throw people out of work, or I think more precisely, it's just going to lead to what they call the old classic speed up in the workplace. And yet here are these Marxists at journals like Jacobin, cheering this thing on. And I just thought, I can see the warrant for this in Marx, in Capital. And
I mean, of course, in Marx there's an ambiguity too, though, because especially in the early period, but then running in a sense right through, there's still a kind of romantic side to Marx. I mean, underneath, there's still the young Marx who has in his mind a sort of reconciliation between human life and human nature. That there'd be this ability once again, that somehow the dialectical residue of this historical arc would ultimately be a state in which there would no longer be an alienation between humanity and the creative work of human hands, right? But this is a disagreement I have. As I say, all my Marxists, all the friends I have who are Marxists, because I like to range widely.
Some of my best friends are Marxists.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, and they tend to be a bit. And they're all heterodox. I mean, or they're all, they see themselves as in a tradition that has moved on from this sort of 19th century industrialist view of production, of cultural production and material production. But, on what basis? It's an interesting thing. You mentioned conversations I'd had recently with China Mieville and Richard Seymour. And they're very interesting on this point. I mean, they both right now are, have raised protests against the confusion between a sort of historical materialism, or what came to be called dialectical materialism, on the one hand, and actual mechanistic materialism. And they've recognized that these two things, as far as I can tell, these two things not only are not implicit in one another, but in some very real sense are at odds with one another. Which raises the question of whether historical materialism is a materialism at all, because, of course, there you have very firm faith in the possibility of rational reflection on history as a process that, in a sense, is almost teleological. And that certainly doesn't fit with the notion of nature as a machine, or
go back to something you said earlier about Marx. The early Marx, the Marx of, say, what are called the 1844 manuscripts, is, I think, a capital R romantic, Schillerian, right, in his conception of work, as something that could in fact be playful, and conceived as there's this part of the 1844 manuscripts, I think it's called A Comment on James Mill, in which he's describing the right way, the non-alienated way of producing goods, and it's all about establishing human relationships. It isn't just making a cup; it isn't just making a table. It's I wish to create a friendly relationship with you by making this table. So it isn't just about the table, it's about the quality of the human relationship that's created through the making and the exchange of goods. But by the time you get to the first volume of Capital, Marx is, go capitalist mechanization.
Well,
So,
again, this is a disagreement. Another Marxist friend of mine, Michael Robbins, we have radically different views of capital. I mean, the book Capital, especially the third volume.
yeah.
To me, I see it as a manifesto of converting the entire world into a factory.
Oh, that's exactly what it is.
Well, okay, you see, I mean, and
I don't see it could read it any other way. But,
well, maybe I should get the two of you on together and let him argue it with you, because I happen to be in agreement with you, so I won't. But the thing is, that's the problem, obviously, right? Is that well, and of course, so many. You mentioned the Jacobin staff, which I mean, the Jacobin is a rather annoying publication half the time. For every good article you find in it, you find two or three fairly insipid or even perverse sorts of article.
I started wondering what was going on there a few years ago when somebody wrote an article talking about the relevance of Karl Kautsky.
Yeah. Okay.
But
Who raised a red flag for you?
I can think of right now. The other thing about the Marxist account of technology, on which I guess I'd comment, is that, so according to this account that Marxists give, right, technology under capitalism is designed precisely to surveil and exploit workers. Right? Technology is not neutral.
Right.
And yet, after the revolution, or during the revolution, or after the revolution, somehow this technological edifice of exploitation and surveillance and discipline is going to be somehow magically become an edifice of liberation. And I guess I missed something there. I don't understand how, like I said, a technology that is made to exploit, that is made to surveil, is all of a sudden going to lose these qualities.
Well, of course, there is still a trace of, how can I put it, Hegelian determinism in the narrative. I presume, of course, is that there really is a inevitable dialectic divulgence in history, and that one way or another it becomes available to reflection. That each historical epoch, each material epoch will somehow exhaust itself in its own dialectical insufficiencies. Just, I mean, in a different vein, when this project is taken over by Heidegger, it becomes each epoch rises and falls because it's only a transient failure properly to respond to the call of being, but even in its failure, it reveals something of the mystery of being, right? Well, in a very materialist vein, there's an expectation that each phase, each epoch of material conditions reveals, but then fails properly to embody the actual necessary movement of material conditions towards the resolution of the historical alienation of humans from the works of the labor. And it's funny, that's a metaphysical premise that's written into, and I have no problem with metaphysical premise. I believe this one's wrong. I believe that in fact the material conditions well, are they wrong? I mean, you and I both have a kind of sympathy for a genuine romantic belief that there is such a thing as a human spiritual nature that would, if it, to the degree that it can, resist and rebel against this distortion and suppression of the natural. So maybe that's where the faith should be placed. Which is what makes it so strangely contradictory that say so many people on the cutting edge of the left today in that sphere. There's the British Marxist mainstream ally themselves to the most pitiless mechanistic views of nature. They really, they're all on the side of well, say like eliminativism or something like that. I mean, they really think that somehow it's liberating to reduce consciousness to a functional system and to see nature as a mechanistic economy, and don't seem to be fully aware that strive though you want against God or the gods or whatever it is that you see as mystification or as structures of alienation or oppression. What you're really doing is simply fortifying the metaphysics of the market.
Right, and sanctioning that market's indifference to any manner of human suffering, which has always been the crux of it for me. I mean, if I'm immediately suspicious of anyone or any idea which puts an imprimatur onto any kind of misery and says, well, this is always for the greater good.
Oh, well, then that's another reason you couldn't be a Thomist. So
okay. This, in the long run, right? I mean, whenever I hear something prefaced with "in the long run," I know that some kind of horror is about to be justified.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, there are two kinds of ghostly politics. I like to think of it. Those who are fanatically and obsessively committed to the institutions and economies and spiritual ecologies of the past. Then you get things like that Crayon and Phimister we talked about. I mean, an utterly depraved fascination with Baroque Christendom. Okay, they wouldn't put it that way, but that's what they're really thinking. They're thinking of a throne and altar accommodation, the absolute state, a politically enfranchised church that has the power to kill or use the secular arm to kill. They're actually nostalgic for this because, of course, it's what was in the past, and therefore the ghosts of the ancestors who demand to be appeased require that we devote ourselves to serving and, if possible, resurrecting these structures of power because, that's our ghostly politics. But of course, they're the ghosts of the future as well, the ghosts of generations unborn. And it's amazing how much you can sacrifice to those ghosts as well, how much you're willing to sometimes. And among, what was it, Eric Hobsbawm, when he was asked if the result of the Stalinist period and the tens and tens of millions of deaths that it brought about, if the result of that had been the ultimate creation of the socialist utopia or something like it, would it have been worth it? And without pausing, he said, "Oh, yes, of course." So yeah, I know what you mean. Luckily, none of the Marxists I actually know as friends think that way. I mentioned Michael Robbins and China Mieville and Richard Seymour, the people I've talked to recently. None of them are in that camp. But Hobsbawm was of that generation that. Or like Edmund Wilson, you remember, even.
It's concerning to learn these kinds of things about your favorite historians. I knew this about Hobsbawm. Christopher Hill was the same way.
Yeah.
I think Christopher Hill is one of the greatest historians who ever wrote. I think in some ways he's even greater than Hobsbawm. The same.
It's well, I mean, that's the problem with absolute commitments. That's why I'm trying my best to become as tepid in all of my beliefs as possible. I'm hoping ultimately to become always only about 47% committed to anything I truly believe in.
Okay.
I'm just short of 50%, because you get 50%, you're in danger of tipping over the edge into fanaticism, and the next thing you know, you'll be blowing up post offices in the name of generations unborn. So,
on which, have you seen How to Blow Up a Pipeline?
no, I have no idea what this is.
Oh, it's a film that's been out for a few months. I saw it about a month ago, I guess, and it raises many of these similar issues. It's about a group of eco activists well, I might as well give away, the spoiler here. They blow up a pipeline,
that might actually already have been adumbrated by the title. So I'm not sure you're giving a lot away there.
Well,
it would be surprising if the plot were about creating a bakery.
But it does raise these kinds of questions about, are you willing? How many lives are you willing to snuff out in the hopes of a glorious future? And even though we don't usually think of eco-activists and Stalinists in the same sentence, they're posing the same kinds of quandaries.
Well, I mean, I have one young Marxist I know who's not a friend, but he's very clever. I mean, he's very open in saying that. I mean, he's of that older. I don't know. You'd think he was of the World War II generation in the way he talks, but he's actually only about 25. But he said to me, the question isn't what you're willing to die for; it's what you're willing to kill for. And so, I mean, yes, we're always walking the edge. But anyway, I don't want to tar anyone with a brush they don't deserve to be tarred with. So, but it is the case that you and I think both share a preference for the Christian socialist tradition, largely British, but not exclusively so. Certain figures seem to emerge. I mean, it's Ruskin, Morris,
R.H. Tawney.
R.H. Tawney, of course. Yeah, I mean that.
You could arguably put. I mean, as in terms of, I guess, its latest, the latest figures in that lineage. I mean, certainly I'd put Milbank in there. If you wanted to stretch the definition of Christian enough, I mean, you might even want to put Tony Benn in there. I always loved Tony Benn.
He's Christianish.
Christianish. All right. Christian adjacent.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Really, that's what all of us are at best anyway, I mean, the only real Christian.
Was it Nietzsche who said that the last Christian died on the cross?
Yeah, the only true Christian died on the cross. Yeah, that was Nietzsche. Actually, though, that's a healthy aphorism for Christians to fix in their consciences, because it's look, when we try to make sense of the early ministry of Christ, say, if we can actually reconstruct it, and I actually think we can do this with far more certainty than a lot of New Testament scholars do, because I think that the Logia traditions that we find in the Synoptics really do reflect memories of the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth fairly convincingly, right? You realize that the ministry of the Galilee and the ministry of the Galilee on the way to Judea and the cross is so preponderantly a ministry to the poor and to giving the poor, I mean, like practical advice on how to survive in an unjust system of law and commerce and social justice. That you already have there the paradigm for what a Christian revolutionary politics should look like, right? it's not really as complicated as we'd like to make it. And the thing that the Christian socialist tradition in Britain, I think, it wasn't right socially one way or the other. You can't characterize it in current terms of left and right, progressive or conservative. It doesn't fit into those molds. I mean, Ruskin was a Tory monarchist. It's not. That's not the issue. But what unites them is a sense of immediacy, right? I mean, that you talked about your distaste for anything that says, well, in the long run, the distasteful exigencies of the present will be justified.
Yeah.
There's none of that. I mean, there really isn't any of that in Morris and Ruskin. They actually had this sort of militantly naive, and Tawney too. Although Tawney, he's more of a realist in the sense that more and more he came to believe that though he did not like the modern nation state, that its mechanisms could be employed to mollify and ameliorate the distribution, the unjust distribution of wealth, right?
Yeah, I think there's, just to speak specifically about Tawney, I think there are two Tawneys. There's the Tawney who was at one time a guild socialist, and I think that's a fascinating tradition in itself. The guild socialist, that's the Tawney of the acquisitive society. That's the Tawney of a great deal of equality. The book that he wrote about a decade later. It's the Tawney who wrote a great book about 16th century enclosures.
Right.
And then there's the Tawney who became, I don't want to quite say a policy wonk for the Labor Party, but basically became a member of the political class. And yeah, that's the Tawney that you're describing. The one who says, yeah, okay, we have this welfare state, and maybe that's the best we're going to get, on this side of paradise. But I always liked the earlier Tawney.
Oh yeah, I like the earlier Tawney too. I mean, that's. But the point I was making was just that just as in the the language of Christ was always one of immediacy. I think the reason, for instance, that the Gospel of John, I think though the Gospel of John is a highly theologized portrait of Christ, the thing that comes through that is an action that is not just a theological commentary on, but in a sense a real emanation of the ministry of Jesus, is immediacy of judgment. In this instant, you're already being judged. There is no future horizon that allows you to rest content with half measures. The judgment scene in Matthew, the judgment was passed in this life with how you dealt with the poor, how you dealt with the homeless, the sick, the suffering. And there's no social structure, there's no ultimate project that in any way alters that demand for absolute justice in the present, or not injustice in the sense, but absolute justice as mercy in the present to all, and that, even those being denounced. Yeah, and I don't know. I'm being rather vague here, though. The reason I find myself always returning to this Christian socialist tradition is that it doesn't allow itself, at least those figures we've discussed, doesn't allow itself prudent accommodations with the evils it denounces.
We certainly see that in the Ruskin of Unto This Last.
Right. Unto This Last is sort of scripture to me.
Now note through all four of those essays. Morris, I always think, and I say this in the book, I don't think Morris ever really was a Marxist. He liked to tell himself that he was a Marxist.
Right, but did he ever actually read Marx?
Well, here's the thing, right? I mean, he did. And what he says himself I really love his candor here. He says, well, at some point I tried to crack open Das Kapital, and I'm trying to remember exactly what he said. He says something to the effect of, it racked my brain. I mean, in other words, it kind of went over my head what Marx was getting at. So I'm not really into Das Kapital, but he's always talking about Ruskin. Yeah, I don't think Morris ever really was a Marxist. He was a guy who, succumbed, I think, to the radical chic of his era, and decided that maybe I better sign on with the Social Democratic Federation. But yeah, that's one of the things that I really like about the British socialist tradition is precisely the not just this. It's the moral sense, in some way. And this gets me to something that's in Ruskin that I think is really important for how we think about economics, and that is that Ruskin argues that one has to have some kind of a moral and religious valuation of what we consider wealth.
Yeah.
We have to do something beyond the gross domestic product, which is simply quantitative in the way that it measures economic development. And that distinction between wealth and ilth, as he puts it in Unto This Last, is something that needs to be inscribed.
No, I mean, to me, that's Unto This Last. I mean, first of all, even the title right there has to do with precisely this issue of immediacy, because it's not about the whole point of quoting scripture there. What is it? I will give unto this last even as unto thee. Is it not lawful for me to do what I will with what is mine? It simply means that there's no prudent calculation here of deserts and of the proper scale of value between labor and reward or anything of that sort. That there's simply the abundance of giving, so that the gift, the justice lies in giving. And then the injustice would lie in calculating the cost, or in calculating the proper remuneration on a scale of values. And that right there, I mean, it captures the sense of the immediate claim that every other makes on me. I mean, that's the spiritual heart of the book. And to me, those four essays, of course, the fourth one is sort of like 7 essays squeezed together, because he was forced to terminate the series early as a result of the protests that the essays were evoking from the good and the pious, or at least the respectable and the prosperous. Is precisely this refusal to grant the practical constraints on what is possible as a social economy, and the insistence, again, a sort of militant insistence, that the very concept of wealth has to be reconceived from the ground up and has to be something in keeping with a common human nature, with common cosmic nature, from which our entire view of reality have become progressively alienated. I always loved the William Morris. How did he know that capitalism wasn't evil? It was hideous,
Yeah, his critique first was aesthetic.
Yeah.
And even when you explore the notion of the aesthetic for Morris, it's far more than just, well, how does it look?
Well, and with Ruskin too. I mean, that's what the point is the due proportion of human relation. Seeing the beautiful measures of real human relation in one another, seeing the face of God in another, for instance. There is an immediate aesthetic appeal that's also a moral appeal that demands hesitation, reverence, that makes our delight in one another the ground of our moral sensibility. And both Ruskin and Morris are convinced that capitalism is the suppression of this primary knowledge.
Well, this is one of the most profound things for me, not just about Ruskin, but about the whole Romantic tradition that I cover, is its challenge to these canons of what we consider to be realism.
Yeah.
The canons of realism in economics are, to go back to our earlier conversation, purely numerical, purely quantitative, purely mechanistic, and the Ruskins and the Romantics of this world are demanding that we see that in fact the world is not just could be, already is a place of great beauty and wonder and marvel, and that these things are part of creation every bit as much as utility and service. And this is one of the reasons why I think that word visionary is often misunderstood. A visionary we usually think of as like a dreamer, right? Somebody who, or a utopian, right? In some sense. Well, a visionary is somebody who sees, right?
Yeah.
A visionary has vision. And so what does the visionary see? He or she sees what is there. And I think, which is why I often think that people with our kinds of politics should disavow the term idealism. I would want to argue very, very vociferously that we're the realists.
No, wait a minute.
It's capitalist.
Idealism and realism were at one time considered synonyms, So I would cling to the older understanding of idealism as the realism of form.
Point taken.
There are forms, therefore we can know the forms of things, therefore we can talk about them. That there's not that reality is not an occult Ding an sich that's dissembled by the phenomenal veil of reality, but that in fact that beauty and that mystery that we perceive, the qualitative reality of our experience is in fact the real, whereas the bare abstractions of economic determinism, historical determinism, even physical determinism are the fantasies. So I agree with you that we're the realists. I just don't want to. I don't want to betray the idealist past by suggesting that the way people speak of idealism today is it's just it's a sort of airy trust in abstractions. It wasn't. It was a belief in the infinite ontological density of the phenomenal order in which we're immersed in every moment.
Well, this is why also I think that when, if we're going to talk about some sort of a Christian form of politics or a Christian form of revolutionary politics and whatever that would mean and whatever that would look like, I think it's essential that we assert that love is a power and not simply, an abstraction. It's
and not simply an emotion.
I'm thinking about it, mainly in the way that one of my favorite Protestant theologians to beat up on is Reinhold Niebuhr.
I'll hand you a baseball bat. And
Niebuhr's always talking about love as,
and then explaining why it has to be betrayed.
Some sort of, I'm thinking of somebody like A.J. Muste, the great anti-war activist and pacifist, who always thought that love is a power in the present. You should put we should put more reliance on this.
I would go so far as to say that love is a correctly scientific ontology, because that actually Dante got it right. The love that moves the sun and all the other stars is actually not only it's not a pious claim, it's not a metaphysical claim only, it's actually a claim about physics. The reason I say this, this would take us off on a different path, but of course, one of the things that, one of the great ironies of the machine and the mechanism, of course, we talk about how what began as a scientific method metastasized into a metaphysics. And suddenly all the things that had just been laid aside as bracketing out for scientific method, such as the soul, consciousness, God, and all, suddenly now, since this was our tacit metaphysics, suddenly had to be brought back into the picture, but explained now in terms of mechanism. So you get the utterly implausible projects of trying to reduce consciousness, say, to something other than consciousness, if you're, say, Daniel Dennett or the eliminativists, or try to reduce it to functionalism, which makes no sense. And also, reduce nature to a machine, et cetera, and all that. But it's not just the accidental metastasis that's the problem. The scientific picture itself is an error, right? I mean, even at the level of method, mechanism was always very limited. A sort of tool to employ. It's very useful dealing with a specific operation within a system. It could never explain the system. This is the old joke is, could a biologist fix a radio? No, because of course, the biologist never sees the system, has been taught to think in physicalist corpuscular terms, and so doesn't see the system. It's only now that systems biology has become a serious movement of resistance against the impotency of the genetocentric model that you have people say, well, we have to start talking about information in life. And as the more they talk about it, you realize that they're just putting form and finality back in, and intentionality becomes basic. Cells edit their own genome, systems arrange themselves. Why? Because they're in relation to a realm of values, information values, And you begin to realize that there's a kind of basic impulse in every system, every coherent, say, negentropic system, whether it's life or mind or language, that is just a pure ecstasy towards a desired end. It would take me days to try to lay that out as an argument, but nonetheless, I believe this to be true. That when you talk about love as a real force, I think you can make the argument that the high medieval notion of love as a basic physical as well as metaphysical and spiritual truth can be argued from the current evidences of the life sciences, especially. So I didn't mean to go off on that detour, but. Yes, but love is real.
It also explains why romantics, such as Coleridge, would talk about imagination as a way into reality, not a way away from reality, or some sort of a path outside of reality. So again, it's a form of vision. So. Also, if I could also say that I think this is also one of the reasons why I can't take economics seriously as a science.
When it's demonstrated such amazing predictive accuracy, almost like quantum mechanics. I mean, it's just.
It's economics is just so transparently an ideological tool that I can't sometimes see how economists don't, when they're among themselves, they must laugh at the rest of us, for thinking Wow, we got them to keep believing in this nonsense.
Oh yeah. Compared to economics, sociology is as rigorous as physics. Compared to economics, anthropology is closer to physics than it is to economics in terms of rigor. And all of those, of course, are Wissenschaften. They're sciences that are almost impossible to separate from ideological commitments of one kind or another. But economics, I would say, is the supreme example of this.
I think it was W.H. Auden who once, I think he was addressing Phi Beta Kappa at Harvard, and part of the poem was an admonition: "Thou shalt not commit the social science."
Yes, precisely, as that was Auden. Yeah, one of and a maxim we should all live by. I think. Sometimes I'm tempted to think that one way you could define modernity is the triumph of syntax over semantics. In the sense that in the realm of physics, well, just as in language, of course, people are always trying to construct theories of the evolution of language that put syntax in place, and then semantics are kind of an accidental accretion thereon. But basically, it's the syntactical function that's real, that translates a stimulus into behavior or data into behavior, right? And but of course, this makes no sense because syntax and semantics can't exist in abstraction from one another. Neither can exist in abstraction from symbolic thought. There will never be a plausible theory of the evolution of language. There will be plausible stories of the evolution of language users, how maybe organisms become more and more capable of language. But I'm going to say now that language in that picture is a formal and a final cause. It's something into which we evolve, not something that evolves. And I would say the same thing of life, and I would say the same thing of consciousness. But also, it's when we decided, and I don't blame Galileo for this. I'm not anti-scientific, but when Galileo reduces physics to math and mathematical quantification, so that the world that physics deals with is the world of mass and momentum and exchanges of energy in purely mechanistic causal terms, which there is no. And the qualia of experience are purely the imposition of our minds on that reality, right? So that becomes the realm of the really real. Everything, then the syntax of physics becomes the standard of which all other sciences, all other arts, all other experience are to become mere local specifications. So that means that consciousness and qualitative consciousness and the redness of a rose, but also life as distinct from just mere chemistry, and chemistry is distinct from mere atomic forces. All of that is, in a sense, secondary and even illusory. The really real is the realm of the syntactic. The semantic, that's a convention, right? In a sense, it's the triumph of Democritus. All these things are by convention. The reality is just atoms in the void, right? It's amazing.
So what I'm thinking about, yes, and yes. Right. But what I'm thinking about while I'm listening to you is, I guess some issues that I'm grappling with in this book I'm writing about automation. And one of the first chapter is basically going to be about this idea that somehow you can turn everything into information, and how I think that this does have something to do with how we think about God as in terms of power and volition, agency. And how, in other words, do we get to the Ray Kurzweils of the world? Who who do clearly see, the world is nothing but data,
Right.
information, and yet they talk about this kind of prosthetic, machinic immortality. So there must still be in us, even in Ray Kurzweil, right? There still must be some urge toward, what we call theosis, right?
Right.
And so how I'm trying to grapple with how you can join those two things together, right? The fact that he clearly sees reality in the terms that you've described, and yet he also wants to live forever.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the basic contradiction, but I mean, of course, that's the whole point. I mean, we can't, if we reduce our picture of reality to the barely syntactical, we'll never answer any questions really of any significance. One of the interesting, have you ever, who Robert Rosen was, the biologist who wrote Life Itself?
No.
Okay, brilliant man. It's a book you have to read 3 times to get through, unless you have his level of technical expertise, which is a rare attainment. But one of the arguments he makes there and in other essays he wrote on the issue was that basically in the modern age we've chosen not only a picture of reality, but we've made a fundamental epistemological decision regarding what counts as an explanation. And we've chosen this sort of, as I say, this bare syntactical model, so that the physics becomes not the bare minimal conditions that have to be met by reality, by a physical reality, but in fact the ultimate explanation of the reality. So that anything that seems to fall outside the realm of what physics can explain would have to be seen as a kind of strong emergence that nonetheless could be reduced to physical principles again. The eliminativists, in their naivete, for instance, actually believe that the laws of life, the laws of consciousness, can be reduced to laws of biology can be reduced to laws of chemistry to laws of physics. And yet, of course, this isn't actually true, because reduction is useless if you can't then reconstruct what you've reduced from the principles at which you've arrived. And the principles of physics, in the sense of Galileo, through Newton, through Einstein, through the present, have given us, do not give us principles from which we can reconstruct all those systems levels, right? They are inexplicable in those terms. So what Rosen said was actually life itself should be seen as the fundamental science, biology, and physics merely as its minimal physical conditions. So the laws of life are the ones by which we understand the cosmos, and things like physics and chemistry are just local specifications of those laws. Now, me, being a classical idealist, I say yes, but of course there's still a higher law of consciousness, or mind, of which life is a local specification. And mind is inherently teleological and is driven by love for the transcendental horizon of reality, for the good, the true, the beautiful. And in that sense, you could say that things like homeostasis, the desire to persist, why biological systems inexplicably construct these elaborate negentropic systems, not by accident, but by clear internal design, in which you have the elaborate systems of cells communicating with one another, rather than lapsing back restfully into the oblivion of entropy. Well, the same is true of someone like Kurzweil. He's not going to be able to explain it to you at the level of his view of reality. He's simply a very complex collection of bits of information. Not even really well created. I mean, it's not even so much a collection as a kind of fortuitous coalescence for the time of bits of information. And yet, inexplicably, and I doubt if he would ever reflect on it, there's something on him that craves being. There's a conatus essendi that goes beyond merely the fortuitous survival of species and natural selection. He wants to be a god, right? And yeah, and it never seems to occur to us, well, maybe we should invert our picture. Maybe that desire for godhood is the fundamental law, and everything else has to be understood in terms of it.
Oh, I completely agree. I having read through Kurzweil's oeuvre, I think that you're absolutely right. He can't explain this desire to be godlike simply in terms of cybernetics or information science and data collection. He just has it, and he can't explain why. And I think it's insane to think that he's ever going to achieve it. But what's interesting to me is the desire, not whether he's any of this transhumanist.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's the thing is the desire itself would seem to be an irrational desire. Once, to your own satisfaction, you've been disabused of the illusion of an indwelling spiritual nature or whatever. It is a curious thing that one then wants to construct the reality that one's taken leave of, But that's the nature of life, of course. It strives for more life.
That's one thing I've noticed about a lot of these transhumanists is that there's a real contempt for flesh and matter and the natural world, which is
Oh, and to be honest, animal creation. If you're a transhumanist, you're committed to the notion that biology is a thing to be transcended.
Yeah, they're very explicit about this.
Yeah, and so animal creation is now simply a huge collection of failed and abortive attempts at something we alone among terrestrial animals might yet achieve. I heard some transhumanists. I don't want to get. I might have the wrong name, so I'm not going to. Just in case I'm blaming the wrong guy for this, but I think I know who said it. But just in case I'm wrong, I won't say. But basically, I saw him in a discussion saying, really, that we have to get over this sentimentality about endangered species and things like this. These are, inherently transient organic systems that have reached their cybernetic limit in terms of the conveying of information that can constrain the future, right? All they can do is reiterate the kind of species they are ad infinitum, and that this is a pointless moment in the evolutionary history of the cosmos.
Sounds like something Paul from Mary would say.
Well, what do you know? That's who I thought said it. So, but again, don't take my word for it. It's a terrible and terrifying thought. I think
the way that I usually explain transhumanism is that I think this is, if you want to go sort of Marxist for a second, I think this is a sign that our ruling class has given up on the planet. They've decided that the world is irredeemable on any number of levels: economic, ecological, social, political, and they've just decided to secede from the species.
Yeah. No, I think that's a perfectly fair comment, and I'm not even sure they would object to that characterization that many of the people we're talking about.
Yeah.
What's there to recommend a simian species with ideas above its station? Well, only the potentiality that it might become something that will make being a billionaire worthwhile. So you have the resources to make sure that all those generations of all the history of phylogenetic ascent from, I don't know, amoeba to man will be justified by the immortality of Jeff Bezos in a virtual reality from which all real organic life has been utterly purged.
I thought Jeff Bezos already was an android, but
that's quite possible. I mean, I do occasionally. Or who's the Facebook kid? Zuckerberg.
Zuckerberg too.
Yeah, no, I'm pretty sure that he's a computer simulation. I don't even think that there's actually
that kind of Roman emperor haircut.
Yeah.
And
has anyone actually ever shaken his hand? I'm pretty sure that you would go right through it. I think there's a holographic technology at work there, and that he's a computer generated sort of early AI impression of what a human being would be like if AI could be human. But I can't prove that either, since I would never get through. He's like the emperor at the center of the Forbidden City, like many billionaires. You just can't get close enough to him to tell. Is he really still alive, or has he just been mummified so that the Middle Kingdom will not perish? This was a question even in the early Qin. Shirwan-Di, did he really die, or when we think he died, or did he rule for many, many years as a corpse? Well, in a sense, a slightly less gruesome sense, that might. I'm pretty sure that the future that awaits us is to be ruled by simulations of human beings. Well, look then. Let me ask you this. Is the formula for the re-enchantment of the world something that my dog can help us understand?
I think so. Yeah. And Roland struck me as an extremely wise and generous canine. And I think there are two things in his remarks that especially toward the end of Roland and Moonlight. One is that it seems to me he has a profoundly, I don't want to say hopeless, but pessimistic view of what's ahead of us. Basically, we're just going to get more and more spiritually diseased and desiccated, and almost to the point where it's going to be impossible to re-enchant. But then there's this other. If I can read this passage.
You have a copy right there.
Yeah, he says. So you say that all sounds rather hopeless, I remarked after a moment. I don't know, he said with a kindly frown. Probably, but not necessarily. Whatever the case, it's obvious to me that the only way your kind can hope to find its way back to the theophanic cosmos, if you can do so before destroying the world with your profligate indifference to its ecological fragility, is by breaking the hold of these counterfeit forms of faith. I guess
that's an uncommonly somber moment for him, but yeah, okay.
Yeah, you're specifically there talking about various forms of fundamentalism.
Okay.
But I guess where this, I think, connects up with my book as well is that I see capitalism as itself a counterfeit form of faith, and that therefore maybe that, for somebody like me at least, that's where to begin. Not so much imagining, what would a re-enchantment look like, though that's I think we would have to do that, but begin from demonstrating that all these other forms of faith really are spurious, and trying to understand, why is it and what is it about these things that's so beguiling? What are they speaking to in us, in their very fraudulence? So I guess that's where somebody like me would begin, is more identifying the forms of fraudulence before or at the same time that we're trying to imagine what a re-enchanted world would look like. And right. I think this is one of the this would be a real problem with the project of re-enchantment, would be that it might end up being too much all in our heads.
Yeah. Well, it also might be, to take us back to where we began this conversation, also, it would be hard, perhaps, without first exposing fraudulent forms of enchantment or the beguiling aspects of certain kinds of social and cultural authority, is it could become a kind of dangerous and despotic nostalgia. Again, I mean, we talked about the integralists. Well, they're looking for a kind of re-enchantment. It's the re-enchantment of a universe governed by a sort of Christian Zeus, a god of sovereign power, jealously guarding the boundaries of his world. But I mean, it's a craving for a kind of re-enchantment. So I mean, until you expose, unless you first make a clear distinction between what is genuinely, naturally, mysteriously enchanting about the reality, about the structure of life, about the structure of mind, about the structure of community. The so-called project of re-enchantment in the abstract can just become just another battle among different kinds of obscurantist authoritarianisms, and you end up with something. For those who haven't read the book, we should explain Crayon and Phimister's book on integralism recommends. The proper aim of the Christian view for the human future should be a kind of papal empire, under whose canopy there are individual absolute monarchies, within which only baptized Catholics would, and only male baptized Catholics, in fact, would enjoy full political enfranchisement, in which full coercive powers of the state, including capital punishment, would be used to enforce laws against blasphemy or against sexual deviation or against false religion, which would be any religion proscribed, in which only ordination would be limited to Catholics. And there's even a footnote in that book that defends the practice of slavery as being in keeping. But right, so for anyone out there who thinks that we're being excessive, you can't be excessive for these people.
It's pretty insidious. But I mean, and it's also allied, if I'm not mistaken, it's also allied to a kind of libertarian economic.
Strangely enough, yeah, because there's the American aspect of I can't remember which of the two little deviants, whether it's Crayon or Phimister, that's the American. But then suddenly, out of nowhere, we get a sort of libertarian capitalist economics, a sort of defense also of.
It seems to me that when you think about it, you probably could somehow reconcile slavery with libertarian capitalism.
Oh, sure.
Because, if you're thinking of slavery as maybe debt slavery, right. Which I think is I don't know if they mentioned that, but I'm sure
I believe that's what the point is. There's not a defense of chattel slavery, although it does defend hereditary slavery.
Right.
Because, of course, it's all about the patria potestas, isn't it? The household is basically an extension of the head of the household, who's the monarch of the family. And so his debts accrue to them as well, unto this last generation.
But getting back to your original point, you're right. I mean, this is a form of re-enchantment.
Yeah.
It's
of a ghastly, morbid, and satanic kind, but Satan can be very glamorous, I hear.
And so, yeah, you would need something of what we used to call the old hermeneutic of suspicion to try to sift through, I think, these different kinds of visions of a re-enchanted world, to distinguish between the nefarious and the genuinely transcendent and emancipatory. And I also like your point in this book about trying to overcome various kinds of rigid doctrinal demarcations, and trying to see what is true and good and beautiful in other religious traditions. This is another thing that I see among these integralists, and not just among integralists. I see this as well among evangelical Protestants.
Sure.
That there's only one road, man, and if you don't follow it, you're gonna end up in hell.
Yeah, well, there's a vexed point, isn't it? Well, before we get to that, because we can finish on that, and we can abuse the Thomists again for a different. But I've made the point before. It's only again, it's a kind of mechanistic categorization. But it's only in the modern period that the idea of religion as an anthropological category, which we understand, hermetically sealed systems of propositions at war with one another, is what we mean by religions in the plural. It's very hard to find the word religio in the pre-modern or in the plural. It is a virtue primarily. The essence of true religion is this. You feed the hungry, you look after widows and orphans. You welcome strangers, and of course you're searching for religious. But when Nicholas of Cusa talks about the true religion, it's not the true religion. It's on true religion. He's assuming that all persons are engaged within this common realm of activity. Now, he may be obliged as a Christian to believe that the Christian teachings are the ones that provide the greatest amount of knowledge about the ultimate ends of creation or whatever. But even within that, he's making arguments what Christians can learn from the Quran, for instance. And in reading that, you realize, of course, that as yet no one has come up with the idea that religions are rival propositional systems. I was talking to John Milbank not long ago, since we've mentioned him already, and we know and love the little goblin. He's a great man. The sort of renewed Christian vision of reality would not be simply a reprise of these absolutisms, but would be this sort of creative task also of reversing supersessionisms of all kinds, not only of Christian supersessionism with regard to Judaism, but with regard to paganism. That in a sense, all of the powers, all of the vital agencies of nature, in which he and I both actually do believe. I mean, I think we've been fairly open about the fact that we refuse to deny the existence of fairies, because we just know they're there, and everybody knows they're there because all these different cultures assure us of that. But anyway, yes, is that that too has to recover. Curiously, it was John who said this, not me. It sounds like me, but it was John who said, recovery of Christian future was a recovery of the pagan past as well as the Jewish past, and to me, I think this is absolutely true. That part of the history of the sort of nihilistic terminus at which modernity arrives is the result of certain historical failures within canonical Christendom, Christianity. Among them, this ever narrowing sense of the realm of the sacred, or the sanctified, at least. If you read Ephesians, for instance, it doesn't say that Christ destroyed or damned the other powers, right? It just put them in the right order again, so that the hierarchy of earth and heaven will ultimately be restored, and God will be all in all. But curiously enough, it never says, no, these false gods will be, and of course, they believe that these false gods were real beings, or sort of like angelic figures, will be damned. It's rather they'll be restored to the proper relationships within the cosmic and divine community. And I do think that there, when we talk, say, about the integralists, all right, or other kinds of fundamentalists, the curious thing is, it's fascinating that they want to recapitulate a ghastly failure. I mean, it doesn't seem to occur to them that modernity exists precisely because of how deficient, defective, and how destructive of human nature the early modern nation state and the early modern economic and political realities with which the institutional church had associated itself as yet another pillar of absolute authority.
Yeah, they have absolutely no sense of historical consciousness.
Right. I mean, you would think that secularism was an invading horde on horseback that one day rode into the Western world and overthrew everything, rather than the actual, and forgive me for using the word, the actual dialectical result of the history of modern Christendom, of the history of Christendom at large, in a sense.
You want to ask these guys, so if you want to go back in time, what do you think you're going to get?
Except a recapitulation of the history that you so thoroughly deplore.
I don't, yeah.
I mean, he's like, well, the French Revolution was an accident. No one really wanted it. Everyone was happy before then, Everyone loved the Ancien Regime and being under. They loved the enfranchised Gallican Church and Christendom as it existed before modernity was a condition of absolute bliss in which people found an absolute just proportion between their spiritual aspirations and the social order to which they belonged, and which everyone had a happy sense of the transcendent good and the purpose of life and the nuclear family or whatever. And then one day they just said, yeah, but let's try something new.
Yeah, we just listened to Danton and Robespierre, and
right. And it was a mistake. Sorry, it was sort of like the Beatles. We'd never heard anything like that before, and so we went off on a tangent. But otherwise, we were perfectly happy with things the way they were. Humanity was absolutely at home in the world of the throne and altar. It defies invective at times. What do you really want? Do you really want to return to a situation, to a reality that was so oppressive that for the first time in human history we had actual revolution at the social level, that it inspired an actual violent overthrow of the immemorial order of human society and politics.
Well, I guess the only
Oppressive. It was that offensive to basic human spiritual desires.
I would guess that the only response they could possibly give to that is, well, we'll just do it better this time.
Right, which for them means we'll kill more people more quickly. As soon as they blaspheme, we'll be cutting those tongues out without, I don't know what it means.
We could have killed Danton and Robespierre immediately. They should have, yeah.
Well, there's the thing. I mean, that's if anything, Robespierre was we won't be some timid group of Jacobins. We'll be.
To go back to something you said earlier, the vision that you and John have articulated of the various powers and principalities not so much being condemned as being rightly ordered again. I think it bears repeating often that ultimately it seems to me that the Christian view of the end of things is restorative, and even if I could use this oft maligned and misused word, it's therapeutic. There's a healing involved. It's not a juridical matter in the end.
Right. Well, the very term soteria, is the restoration of well-being. It's not actually being freed in a forensic context from condemnation.
It's the cure of souls, as they used to call it, and it is a kind of therapy. Sort of like the way we usually think of it as asking the soul to speak, so that it can be cured.
Well, you mentioned early on, before we even began talking about this, that we might touch at the last on universalism, because it's actually not irrelevant to the topic. I mean, part of the eschatology is, after all, an index of how we understand justice, right? And it's very much different from the unto this last standard, right? Which mercy really does triumph over judgment. It's always been to me, of course, the fatal. Well, it's not Baroque Catholicism. It's not Constantine. I have no problem with an empire becoming Christian if it really had become Christian, And then there were ameliorations of imperial practice that actually were quite impressive for the 4th century and after. But I mean, on the whole, that's not for me where the problem, the nihilistic terminus of certain aspects of the history of Christendom begins. It really does begin with this essential confusion, because it is the case. When my translation of the New Testament came out, before that all shall be saved, one of the more surprising in one sense and purely predictable in other attacks on it came from N.T. Wright. He's an evangelical. He doesn't believe in a hell of eternal torment because he's enough of a New Testament scholar to know that that's not there. Okay, but he is at some level a kind of fundamentalist. What's in the text has to be literally. And surprisingly, when he was talking about, in my translation, I explained why I translated a certain word in the story of the rich man and Lazarus differently than normal, and pointed out that the setting of the story is in Hades, and that this probably the topography of Hades has been taken from the Book of Enoch. N.T. Wright, of all people, objected to this notion that these are two different realms in Sheol, and that we must be talking about heaven and hell, or so, which is very strange because we know that's not what's going on. I mean, there's not really any question here. And it's long been known by competent New Testament scholars that the language of judgment and the little apocalypse in Jesus seems to be part of the Second Temple, but also prophetic tropes regarding imminent historical events cast in an eschatological light, right? But that the Valley of Hinnom and all that really means, as it does in Jeremiah and Isaiah, a place where corpses are to be. So that's why, that's why it's a place that destroys body and soul in the sense of life, body and life, or why there are worms and fires there. These are literal descriptions of the disposal of carrion, and all that. So there's a judgment language in Christ that's very much inflected by the use of tropes of destruction and renewal within history. And you even see this in Revelation, which, though it's on the threshold between time and eternity, nonetheless is about the reestablishment of Jerusalem as a political power, and then all the nations are still out there. So we're not really talking about what people think we're talking about. That got conflated with this language of judgment with a picture of heaven and hell that's really extra-biblical. It has nothing to do with restoration and healing. And so two things have happened there at once. You've lost the notion that there's as it's called in Acts, an apokatastasis ton panton, a restoration of all, or tikkun olam, as it would be in Hebrew, as what we're talking about. Now that you lost that, it has now become a punitive. It's become a totally punitive message, in the sense that what you're being saved from now is God. Christ came to make it okay, so that you don't have to go to hell. And it seems to me that when you have figures like Origen and others who didn't think this way and understood and were, as their, to be honest, much more rigorous biblical hermeneutics fell out of fashion, and as for various imperial reasons of imperial practicality, more and more the simpler picture began to predominate. What was originally a hermeneutical mistake, I mean, it's a mistake. I mean, it's like for the Apostle Paul, for instance, the earliest Christian voice has no concept like this. There's no notion of an eternal hell. It's just not. It's the play isn't on the table. He never thinks to warn people against that. He warns them against death and all that. Is that already there? You've created what has happened is a contradiction has been introduced into what will become the great church orthodoxy, that is itself already so profound a contradiction that it makes it almost impossible to rescue anything like the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth regarding a just order of human relations from these structures of absolute power. That the seeds of nihilism are that early present, which is a rather bleak consideration,
Yeah, I mean, it certainly undermines any sort of notion that it's all because of Constantine. I mean, if these seeds were there that early, then I guess I'd ask then, what hope was there ever there? That this was.
Well, you see, but if you talk about Constantine, you can say this. All right, in the 4th century, Gregory of Nyssa feels no inhibition about his open universalism. Basil tells us that most of the people he knew in his part of the empire believed that whatever hell there was basically a purgatory. It comes to an end. I do think that there is a matter of institutional interest that's part of this story. The tale that ultimately came to be the clearly dominant view, and then the orthodox view, if you're Catholic, because it's actually written into doctrine now, is also part of the history of, not of Christianity, but of Christendom. I mean, that there was an institutional imperative there. Religion is an instrument of social control. That's true. Whether you believe that's all it is a different matter. But as long as the church is an institution within the structure of power society, then obviously the best way to assure that it does its part in regulating social relations and in aiding the stability of the political culture is
preach hellfire.
It's what?
Preach hellfire.
Yeah, I was trying to find a more elegant way of putting it, but you're right. Yeah, hellfire.
Well, you know what?
The prospect of being executed in the morning clarifies the mind, and the prospect of eternal torment, and of course the contortions through which Christian thinkers have put themselves trying to square this picture of things with a set of moral precepts regarding how we relate to one another that seemed entirely to contradict it, is also part of the history of Christianity's self-subversion.
All of which would seem to suggest that any hope for certainly not the revival of Christendom, but any sort of renaissance of Christianity would be the abandonment of any sort of belief in eternal torment. I mean, in other words, this isn't just a...
Well, if not that, then there's no point in hoping for any sort of revival. First of all, it would again recapitulate the history that we already know, but it would not, conspicuously be an improvement on a period of faithlessness. We could seek other paths of re-enchantment.
I have to say that your book enabled me to come out of the closet, as it were, as a universalist. I have to thank you for that. I have long thought that the doctrine of eternal torment was not just a moral atrocity, but it just made no sense.
No, of course it makes no sense. I mean, basically what I'm saying is that God became human in order to save humans from God. I mean, it's completely the opposite of the sort of Athanasian credo. And it makes absolutely, if 1 Corinthians 15 is what Paul understood to be the story of salvation, then, it would seem to be a flat contradiction in terms, but
I know that for a long time, the one argument that convinced me that the notion of eternal torment made no sense was to simply think that, well, okay, if Satan is able to claim one soul, just one, then Satan is one.
Sure. Well, I mean, as if Satan has any interest in that sort of thing. I mean, who is this guy really? But
even on its own terms, it made absolutely no sense.
But also, of course, well, I'm not going to recapitulate all the arguments in the book, mostly because we're drawing to an end now. I have a doctor's appointment. You have to go drink heavily, as I understand you do every afternoon. Actually, I shouldn't say that. These things go out on the internet. Someone will take it seriously. You teach, right, today?
Tonight, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, I've enjoyed the conversation. I was a bit tormented myself at my end. These Canadian wildfires are setting off my pulmonary inflammatory conditions. So I'm sorry if my voice sounds like it's very feeble at the moment. It's just
Wow.
the air quality index is a bit of a problem. But you seem in fine fettle. You're looking good.
I'm a little put out that I didn't get to run today, but that's not because of this. It's because of the air quality.
Yeah, I know. But I just wanted to put it, as you age, the more you remind me of a middle-aged Ronald Coleman. It's a good look. I can see you in The Prisoner of Zenda or something. So it's.
I try to stay healthy, and I try tracking for Rose. So what can I say?
Well,
I do what a guy has to do.
Well, I hope you and yours remain well, and talk to you again soon.
Yeah, soon.
And thanks for doing this, and be well.